You can do anything you want to. You can achieve anything you want to. All you have to do is put a little bit of time into it, a little bit of effort into it. So I figured whatever problems there were out in the world, I could take care of it by just putting my mind to it. So when I was just a kid and I saw that genocide and war was happening in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I thought, okay, well, here's a problem. People don't have food. People don't have water. Let's do something to fix that. Let's raise some cash. Let's find the things we need to find to be able to get these things to people. And on it went for a few years until I finally got to the stage where I thought I need to do more. I need to be more. I need to do a little bit more to help people. So in 2007, I applied for the Australian Youth Ambassadors for Development program and somehow was successful. Well, I applied to go to Cambodia, but then they rang me up and said, listen, I know you applied for Cambodia. You didn't get that. But there's this job in Bangladesh that no one else wants because it's really difficult. How do you feel about it? I thought, yeah, well, I'm pretty egotistical, so let's do it. Let's go for it. Let's have a crack at it. In 2007, September 2007, I went to Bangladesh working with Habitat for Humanity, helping to build homes and recreate villages, rebuild villages that had been destroyed by floods or natural disasters and bring communities out of poverty by helping them get housing. In December 2007, we got hit by a cyclone. 1 minute in, I'm already getting choked up. My job was to write emails to people. That's all I did. Sit at a beautiful desk, air-conditioned room in one of the poorest countries on earth, writing emails and sending pictures to people around the world, telling them about what we do and how they can help. Then the cyclone hit. 3 minutes in. And the cyclone hit and we lost 100,000 people. We lost 100,000 people. That's not to say 100,000 people died. We lost 100,000 people. No phones, no communications, no way to track people. So my job went from being not stressful and laughing about all the inconsistencies in the developing world to having to figure out how we're going to find 100,000 people, how we're going to rehouse them, how we're going to find them shelter. Probably the hardest time of my life was flying into the south of Bangladesh. Walking through land that used to have villages on it, and now there's nothing there. The craziest part was the 150 houses that we have built in that area were all still standing, but there was no people, no cattle, no sheep, no nothing. Stress levels went high, a very difficult time. Somehow we got through it, somehow managed to do what I could to help the situation, but we really needed to find a bit of stress relief, which is where this comes in. See, growing up, I had played basketball, and basketball was a form of stress relief for me. So I figured, here, let me try and get some stress relief. Hopped in a rickshaw with one basketball, tried to explain to the guy to take me to a basketball court. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to Bangladesh, but trying to find a basketball court in a developing country that has no space, 150 million people in a place the size of about 3/4 of Victoria, it's not easy to find a basketball court, but eventually we found one. I hop out of the rickshaw, and for about 10 minutes, yeah, you see, you gotta be paying attention. For about 10 minutes, I just started shooting around. It was amazing. For 10 minutes, stop thinking about all the stress, stop thinking about all the things that had been difficult for the last month, stop thinking about the faces of the people who were staring at me looking for help. It's a hard thing wanting to help and not being able to help. Finally, after 10 minutes, I look up. There's like 100 street kids lined up on the fence. And they're street kids because the clothes are kind of tattered, quite small. You can't really tell how old they are. No shoes, plastic bag wrapped around the wrist. Now, I don't know, having a plastic bag wrapped around the wrist is a sign that they're looking for stuff to find on the ground or trade or pickpocket every now and again. Motion for the 100 kids to come on the court. A little bit of miscommunication because, having a foreigner standing in the middle of a court with a basketball and go like this is actually quite rude in Bangladesh. I didn't realize that this is a rude gesture. So if everyone's Bangladeshi, my bad. Finally, these kids get on the court and start running around. Imagine one foreigner with one basketball and 100 kids running back and forth, and I'm trying to make sure that nobody hits themselves or hurts themselves or run into each other. Complete fail. They just keep running into each other. It's fantastic. Then I hear the screaming. Woo! None like a kid screaming. I turn around and there's a security guard with a big stick beating these kids on the back of the neck, on the back of the legs. More security guards show up, literally grab the kids by the ears, dragging them off the court. I had spent over a decade working in development. I had spent a decade raising money, spent a decade reading, spent a decade teaching even. people about development and what it's like in the developing world. Talked about how there's free education, free medicine. Talked about how levels of investment in developing countries had increased 4, 5, 6, tenfold over the last however many years. Talked about Millennium Development Goals like it was the be-all and end-all. What I didn't realize, good catch. What I didn't realize was that it's not just about food, it's not just about medicine, it's not just about water, it's not just about going into a place and trying to make the infrastructure better, which is an incredibly important thing, don't get me wrong. But here I was standing in the middle of a basketball court with kids who were getting beaten up because they had no value. See, in so many places around the world, street kids don't have any value. They just don't. I spent my life being told you can be anything you want to be, you can be whoever you want to be, you can do anything you want to do. And here are kids who just can't. They had never heard that before. They had never experienced that before. That you can be anything you want to be, you can be whoever you want to be because you don't have any value. What value do you have? In my 12 months in Bangladesh, I saw kids getting run over in the street and left there. A couple of weeks ago, one of our kids who did get run over in the street about a year and a half ago, passed away from the injuries that he has sustained. Because he was run over, and for a few hours, nobody stopped. Rickshaws kept running over him, cars kept running over him. This wasn't an issue about lack of infrastructure. This wasn't an issue of access to health. This was an issue of access to medicine. This was an issue of just too many people, not enough values to make sure that you don't run over a kid. So these 100 kids are getting beaten up, and I'm thinking to myself, this is unbelievable. How can this be possible? How can anyone in the world feel like this about a kid? That was a big lesson. That was a lesson for me. That's where my story ends. We all think in situations like this, in groups like this, that the way we feel about the world, the way we feel about people, is how everyone else around us feels. This is how people see the world as well. Like if I have a certain belief about how people should be treated, then I must be right because I'm being empathetic. And I'm trying to have good values and I'm trying to make sure that everyone has a great life. But the reality is that it's not about good or bad or wanting the best for other people. If your circumstance dictates that you never get around to thinking the street kids are worth anything, then street kids just aren't worth anything. It's a rough time to go through. A few weeks after this experience, experience on a basketball court in Bangladesh, I met up with a few other guys and shared my love for basketball, shared my passion for being in a country like Bangladesh and trying to help people and make things better for everyone around us. What we decided to do was just run a small basketball camp. Real simple. Just open up this camp, let as many kids from the street come in as they wanted to. We had kids from whole corners of the area that we lived in come in and just play basketball for a couple of hours. And it was an amazing experience because these kids had never felt as though they were worth anything because no one else thought they were worth anything. So when they finally came onto the basketball court and were given a shirt, a basketball, given instruction, given water, clean water, little emergency packs full of oil and rice and all the kinds of things that they need to live for a week, it really had a profound effect on them, not just us. That was an interesting little hand gesture just then. That was okay. It had a profound effect on them, not just us, because, as I said, for once they didn't feel like they were worthless. They were genuinely moved by the fact that somebody cared enough to provide something for them, which for us was a very, very strange thing because, it's kind of hard to see a kid and not think that the kid is full of potential because we'd all been through that as well. We'd all been through that experience of thinking that we could do anything, we could achieve anything. That was in early 2008. Since 2008, we've moved from taking care of 100 kids to 35,000 kids in 10 countries around the world. We've gone from spending $1,500 in Bangladesh to spending over $100,000 all around the globe, providing kids with opportunities to go to school, providing kids with clean water, access to health, access to all kinds of educational benefits that they wouldn't have had access to before, all by using a very simple concept that we have to teach people, we have to remind people, is probably the best way to describe it, that they have value and that they have worth. So here's the second part of my story. How do you develop aid? How do you provide aid when aid has already been given? I don't know if that's the right way to ask it. How do you provide help to a community that's already been given plenty of help in terms of food and water and clothing and infrastructure? How do you do it? Well, that was a question we asked ourselves as we were growing. Why is it that these kids don't have a sense of self-worth? What is it that removes that sense of self-worth from their environment? Well, we talked about one of them already, which is overpopulation. When you have that many people, necessarily people start to matter a little bit less because it's hard to work in that kind of a context. It's hard to live in that kind of a context. It's hard to give everyone the same kind of value as you have when there's just such a huge range of people with such a massive gap in terms of socioeconomic status. So what do we need to do to change that? Well, our first idea was, let's get kids from high socioeconomic areas to interact with the lower socioeconomic areas. It's an amazing thing to see these kids that live in these high apartment buildings that overlook slums that are built on water, literally on garbage bags on water, and never have actually met somebody from one of those communities. They live right next to each other. You know, the BMWs, the air-conditioned BMWs drive by the kids walking in the street every single day, but they never actually talk to each other. They never actually met each other. So we organized these tournaments and camps where we'd bring the kids together and see if that had any effect on them. Absolutely amazing. That spark that somebody gets when they realize that somebody that they've never talked to before is similar to them is profound. That spark when they realize that the person that they've just played the sport that they love with has the exact same passion for this game as they do is profound. And it's something that we seem to have overlooked. At least it's something that I seem to have overlooked when I was working in development that whole time. Was that apart from delivering aid, apart from building houses, apart from doing all these things that build up the bricks and mortar of a developing community, how are we dealing with the people? It's not a new concept. It's definitely not a new concept, but it's something that just hasn't been touched on enough. And you'll hear it a little bit from speakers today, I hope. You'll hear it from speakers that have gone into developing countries and done aid work. It's all, if you don't target local communities, if you don't work with people and only seek to provide goods or services without having that human interaction, it becomes very, very difficult to change that paradigm. It becomes very, very difficult to change the thought process of people to start caring about their own communities. We work in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Philippines. In Afghanistan, there is no giving to speak of within the community. People in the higher socioeconomic groups don't really have the opportunity to provide funds or volunteer hours to people in lower socioeconomic areas because it's just not part of daily life. It's the same thing in Bangladesh. It's just not part of the daily life. If we change that, if we find a way to provide people with that opportunity, heads up, here comes another one. If we find that way to give people that opportunity, maybe the paradigm will shift. Maybe people will start caring about the people around them. The kid, one of our kids that was run over about a year and a half ago, as I say, passed away last week. And I got the call that he passed away. And it was obviously a sad moment. It was a very difficult moment to deal with. So, after calling around to everyone else in the group and calling around to our board members who now live in 12 different countries, we decided that what we would do is chip in to help the funeral costs. We had helped the kid in terms of getting an education and clothing and water and food and making sure his family was provided for. Now let's see if we can pay for the funeral. So we ring up Bangladesh and say, hey, whatever you paid for the funeral, please let us know, and we'll provide you with that as well as a little bit extra. The response was that he's been laying on the table for the last 4 days, 4 days. He'd been laying on the table that whole time, and no one had bothered to bury him. That's tough to deal with after 3 or 4 years of working in our group. That's really hard to deal with. Why was he just laying on the table? He was laying on the table because nobody had cared to put him into the ground. It wasn't their responsibility. Why would we put the guy in the ground? There was no money to pay for the funeral, but no one had reached out and said there's no money to pay for the funeral. Nobody thought it was important that the kid get buried. Why not? Isn't he one of our kids? Don't we pay for his well-being and then provide you guys, this organization, with some further funds to make sure that everything's okay? Yeah, but it's not something that we are occupied with right now. It's not on our list of to-dos right now. That's a harsh reality. That's a tough reality. See, I tell these stories not to make you sad, so I hope as the first speaker this doesn't get you down for the rest of the day. The reason I tell you these stories is because I want you to have a think about your own situation. I want you to think about, what are you doing when you want to do more? Because this is an exceptionally unique group of people. You're all here because you want to be here and you have a passion to learn more and know more. So I want you to question what it is that you're doing when you want to do more. Do you really want to stand back and allow these kinds of things to happen in the world? Or do you want to be responsible for more than just saying good things? Do you want to be part of that conversation, which is about changing people's minds about how people are treated? See, it's a simple thing to say that we need to put more money into developing countries. It really is. And up to now, it's helped. It has helped. But that kind of investment, that plateaus at some point because we always forget to talk about people. We always forget to talk about whether we need to be addressing some of the social issues on a more simpler level than the high-level thinking that we do. What is it that causes people to not care about each other? What is it that causes people to not pay attention to the people around them? What is it that causes people to forget that everyone is exactly the same as they are? I think in the last 4 years we've discussed more and more that Disney movies should become part of everyone's day-to-day curricular activities, right? Big bangs were started in late 2007, early 2008 to try and take care of 100 kids. And then only 4 years later, we're taking care of 35,000 kids on a daily basis. Dealing with people helps. Dealing with the people around you helps. Caring for the people around you definitely makes a huge difference. And I hope you think about that for the rest of the day. Thanks for your time.
That was Pierre Johansson, lawyer, basketball fan and dreamer. Next up, Dr. Stephen Coleman, an academic in the fields of ethics and leadership. He's worked in a wide range of ethical fields, including military and police ethics. In this talk, he examines the use of non-lethal weaponry in the hands of the police and the military.
Now, there's a bunch of reasons why we actually do send military personnel rather than police to do these jobs. If Australia had to send 1,000 people tomorrow to West Papua, for example, we don't have 1,000 police officers hanging around that could just go tomorrow, and we do have 1,000 soldiers that could go. So when we have to send someone, we send the military because they're there, they're available, and heck, they're used to going off and doing these things and living by themselves and not having all this extra support. So they are able to do it in that sense. But they aren't trained in the same way that police officers are, and they're certainly not equipped in the same way police officers are, and so this has raised a bunch of problems for them when dealing with these sorts of issues. One particular thing that's come up that I am especially interested in is the question of whether, when we're sending military personnel to do these sorts of jobs, we ought to be equipping them differently, and in particular whether we ought to be giving them access to some of the sorts of non-lethal weapons that police have. Since they're doing some of these same jobs, maybe they should have some of these things. And of course there's a range of places where you'd think these things would be really useful. So for example, when you've got military checkpoints, if people are approaching these checkpoints and the military personnel there are unsure whether this person's hostile or not, so this person approaching here and they say, well, is this a suicide bomber or not? Have they got something hidden under their clothing? What's going to happen? They don't know whether this person's hostile or not. If this person doesn't follow directions, then they may end up shooting them and then find out afterwards either, yes, we shot the right person, or no, this was just an innocent person who didn't understand what was going on. So if they had non-lethal weapons, then they would say, well, we can use them in that sort of situation. If we shoot someone who wasn't hostile, at least we haven't killed them. Another situation, this photo is actually from one of the missions in the Balkans in the late 1990s. Situation's a little bit different where perhaps they know someone is hostile, where they've got someone shooting at them or doing something else that's clearly hostile, throwing rocks, whatever. But if they respond, there's a range of other people around who are innocent people who might also get hurt. You know, the collateral damage that the military often doesn't want to talk about. So again, they would say, well, hey, if we have access to non-lethal weapons, if we've got someone we know is hostile, we can do something to deal with them and know that if we hit anyone else around the place, at least, again, we're not going to kill them. Another suggestion has been, since we're putting so many robots in the field, we can see the time coming where they're actually going to be sending robots out in the field that are autonomous. They're going to make their own decisions about who to shoot and who not to shoot without a human in the loop. And so the suggestion is, well, hey, if we're going to send robots out and allow them to do this, maybe it would be a good idea again with these things if they were armed with non-lethal weapons, so that if the robot makes a bad decision and shoots the wrong person again, they haven't actually killed them. Now, there's a whole range of different sorts of non-lethal weapons, some of which are obviously available now, some of which they're developing. So you've got traditional things like pepper spray, OC spray up the top there, or tasers over here. The one on the top right here is actually a dazzling laser intended to just blind the person momentarily and disorient them. You've got non-lethal shotgun rounds that contain rubber pellets instead of the traditional metal ones. And this one in the middle here, the large truck, is actually called the active denial system, something the US military is working on at the moment. It's essentially a big microwave transmitter. And it's designed, it's sort of your classic idea of a heat ray. It goes out to a really long distance compared to any of these other sorts of things, and anybody who is hit with this feels this sudden burst of heat and just wants to get out of the way. It is a lot more sophisticated than a microwave oven, but it basically is boiling the water molecules in the very surface level of your skin. So you feel this massive heat and you go, I want to get out of the way. And they're thinking, well, this will be really useful in places like where we need to clear a crowd out of a particular area if the crowd is being hostile, if we need to keep people away from a particular place, well, we can do that with these sorts of things. So obviously there's a whole range of different sorts of non-lethal weapons we could give military personnel. And there's a whole range of situations where they're looking at them and saying, hey, these things would be really useful. But as I said, the military and the police are very different. Yeah. Yes, you don't have to look very hard at this to recognise the fact that they might be very different. In particular, their attitude to the use of force and the way they're trained to use force is especially different. The police, and knowing because I've actually helped to train police, particularly in Western jurisdictions at least, are trained to de-escalate force, to try and avoid using force wherever possible, and to use lethal force only as an absolute last resort. Military personnel are being trained for war, so they're trained that as soon as things go bad, their first response is lethal force. The moment the fecal matter hits the rotating turbine, you can start shooting at people. So their attitudes to the use of lethal force are very different, and I think it's fairly obvious that their attitude to the use of non-lethal weapons would also be very different from what it is with the police. And since we've already had so many problems with police use of non-lethal weapons in various ways, I thought it would be a really good idea to look at some of those things and try and relate it to the military context. And I was really surprised when I started to do this to see that, in fact, even those people who were advocating the use of non-lethal weapons by the military hadn't actually done that. They generally seem to think, well, why would we care what's happened with the police? We're looking at something different, and didn't seem to recognise, in fact, they were looking at pretty much the same stuff. So I actually started to investigate some of these issues and have a look at the way that police use non-lethal weapons when they're introduced and some of the problems that might arise out of those sorts of things when they actually do introduce them. And, of course, being Australian, I started looking at stuff in Australia, knowing, again, from my own experience about various times when non-lethal weapons have been introduced in Australia. So one of the things I particularly looked at was the use of OC spray, oleresium capsicum spray, pepper spray, by Australian police, and seeing when that had been introduced, what had happened, and those sorts of issues. And one study that I found, a particularly interesting one, was actually in Queensland, because they had a trial period for the use of pepper spray before they actually introduced it more broadly. And I went and had a look at some of the figures here. Now, when they introduced OC spray in Queensland, they were really explicit. The police minister and a whole heap of other public statements made about it. They were saying, this is explicitly intended to give police an option between shouting and shooting. This is something they can use instead of a firearm in those situations where they would have previously had to shoot someone. So I went and looked at all of these police shooting figures, and you can't actually find them very easily for individual Australian states. I could only find these ones. This is from a Australian Institute of Criminology report showing all people, as you can see from the fine print, if you can read it up the top, police shooting deaths means not just people who have been shot by police, but people who have shot themselves in the presence of police. But this is the figures across the entire country, and the red arrow represents the point where Queensland actually said, yes, OK, this is where we're going to give all police officers across the entire state access to OC spray. So you can see there were 6 deaths sort of leading up to it every year for a number of years. There was a spike, of course, a few years before, but that wasn't actually Queensland. Anyone know where that was? It wasn't Port Arthur, no. Victoria? Yes, correct. That spike was all Victoria. So it wasn't that Queensland had a particular problem with with deaths from police shootings and so on. So this was the point where they introduced it. So 6 shootings across the whole country, fairly consistently over the years before. So the next 2 years was the years they studied, 2001, 2002. Anyone want to take a stab at the number of times, given how they've introduced this, the number of times police in Queensland used OC spray in that period? Hundreds? 1, 3? Thousands, getting better. Right. Explicitly introduced as an alternative to the use of lethal force. An alternative between shouting and shooting. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that if Queensland Police didn't have OC spray, they wouldn't have shot 2,226 people in those 2 years. In fact, if you have a look at the studies that they were looking at, the material they were collecting and examining, you can see the suspects were only armed in about 15% of cases where OC spray was used. All right, it was routinely being used in this period, and of course still is routinely used because there were no complaints about it. Not within this, in the context of this study anyway. It was routinely being used to deal with people who were violent, who were potentially violent, and also quite frequently used to deal with people who were simply passively non-compliant. Right? This person is not doing anything violent, but they just won't do what we want them to. They're not obeying the directions that we're giving them, so we'll give them a shot of the OC spray. That'll speed them up. Everything will work out better that way. Right? This was something explicitly introduced to be an alternative to firearms, but it's being routinely used to deal with a whole range of other sorts of problems. Now, one of the particular issues that comes up with military use of non-lethal weapons and people when they're actually saying, well, hey, there might be some problems, there's a couple of particular problems that get focused on. One of those problems is that non-lethal weapons may be used indiscriminately. One of the fundamental principles of military use of force is that you have to be discriminate. You have to be careful about who you're shooting at. So one of the problems that's been suggested with non-lethal weapons is that they might be used indiscriminately, that you use them against a whole range of people because you don't have to worry so much anymore. And in fact, one particular instance where I think that actually happens, where you can look at it, was the Dubrovka theatre siege in Moscow in 2002, which probably a lot of you, unlike most of my students at ADFA, are actually old enough to remember. So Chechens had come in and taken control of the theatre. They were holding something like 700 people hostage. They'd released a bunch of people, but they still had about 700 people hostage. And the Russian special military police, special forces, Spetsnaz, came in and actually stormed the theatre. And the way they did it was to pump the whole thing full of anaesthetic gas. And it turned out that lots of these hostages actually died as a result of inhaling the gas. Right? It was used indiscriminately. They pumped the whole theatre full of the gas. And it's no surprise that people died, because you don't know how much of this gas each person is going to inhale, what position they're going to fall in when they become unconscious, and so on. There were, in fact, only a couple of people who got shot in this episode. So when they had a look at it afterwards, there were only a couple of people who'd apparently been shot by the hostage takers or shot by the police forces coming in and trying to deal with the situation. Virtually everybody that got killed from inhaling the gas. The final toll of hostages is a little unclear, but it's certainly a few more than that, because there are other people that died over the next few days. So this was one particular problem that they talked about, that it might be used indiscriminately. Second problem that people sometimes talk about with military use of non-lethal weapons, and it's actually the reason why in the Chemical Weapons Convention it's very clear that you can't use riot control agents as a weapon of warfare. The problem with that is that it's seen that sometimes non-lethal weapons might actually be used not as an alternative to lethal force, but as a lethal force multiplier. That you use non-lethal weapons first so that your lethal weapons will actually be more effective. The people you're shooting at aren't going to be able to get out of the way. They're not going to be aware of what's happening, and you can kill them better. And in fact, that's exactly what happened here. The hostage takers who had been rendered unconscious by the gas were not taken into custody, they were simply shot in the head. So this non-lethal weapon was being used, in fact, in this case, as a lethal force multiplier to make killing more effective in this particular situation. Another problem that I just want to quickly mention is that there's a whole heap of problems with the way that people actually get taught to use non-lethal weapons and get trained about them, and they get tested and so on. Because they get tested in nice, safe environments, and people get taught to use them in nice, safe environments like this. You can see exactly what's going on. The person who's spraying the OC spray is wearing a rubber glove to make sure they don't get contaminated and so on. But they don't ever get used like that. They get used out in the real world. Like in Texas, like this. I confess this particular case was actually one that piqued my interest in this. It happened while I was working as a research fellow at the US Naval Academy, and news reports started coming up about this situation where this woman was arguing with the police officer. She wasn't violent. In fact, he was probably 6 inches taller than me and she was about this tall. And eventually she said to him, well, you know, I'm going to get back in my car. And he says, if you get back in your car, I'm going to tase you. And she says, oh, go ahead, tase me. And so he does. Yeah, and it's all captured by the video camera running in the front of the police car. So, you know, she's 72, and it's seen that this is the most appropriate way of dealing with her. And other examples of the same sorts of things with other people where you think, well, is this really an appropriate way to use non-lethal weapons? Yeah, police chief fires taser into 14-year-old girl's head. She was running away. What else was I supposed to do? Or Florida. Police tase a 6-year-old boy at elementary school. And they clearly learnt a lot from it because in the same district, police review policy after children shocked. Second child shocked by taser stun gun within weeks. Same police district. Another child within weeks of tasering the 6-year-old boy. Just in case you're thinking it's only going to happen in the in the United States, it happened in Canada as well. And a colleague of mine sent me this one from London. But my personal favourite of these ones, I have to confess, does actually come from the United States. Officers taser 86-year-old disabled woman in her bed. I checked the reports on this one. I looked at it. I was really surprised. Apparently, she took up a more threatening position in her bed. I kid you not. That's exactly what it said. She took up a more threatening position in her bed. Okay. But I'd remind you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about military uses of non-lethal weapons. So why is this relevant? Because police are actually more restrained in the use of force than the military are. They're trained to be more restrained in the use of force than the military are. They're trained to think more, to try and de-escalate. So if you have these problems with police officers with non-lethal weapons, what on earth would make you think it's going to be better with military personnel? The last thing that I would just like to say, when I'm talking to the police about what a perfect non-lethal weapon would look like, they almost inevitably say the same thing. They say, well, it's going to be something that's nasty enough that people don't want to be hit with this weapon. So if you threaten to use it, people are going to comply with it. But it's also going to be something that doesn't leave any lasting effects. Right? In other words, your perfect non-lethal weapon is something that's perfect for abuse. What would these guys have done if they'd had access to tasers or to a man-portable version of the active denial system? A small heat ray that you can use on people and not worry about. So I think yes, there may be ways that non-lethal weapons are going to be great in these situations, but there's also a whole heap of problems that need to be considered as well. Thanks very much.
Dr. Stephen Coleman, his new book on military ethics will be published this year. The last speaker from TEDx in Canberra is Dr. Sam Prince. He set up a Mexican grill franchise while he studied medicine and poured some of the profits into healthcare and education for disadvantaged kids in Asia and Australia.
I'm proud to say that Zambrero Group is the fastest growing restaurant in Australia, and it allowed us to divert some time and funds into one of my other passions, which is education. And to this end, we were successful in building 15 IT centres and integrating them successfully into the wider education curriculum in the Asia Pacific region. So I find myself a Scottish-born Australian doctor with Sri Lankan heritage, now running a chain of Mexican restaurants and doing aid work in the Asia Pacific regions in places like Cambodia, and now in remote communities in Northern Territory. So I guess my life is a bit of a mess. So today I wanted to take a Jobsian approach and just talk about 3 stories. No big deal, just 3 stories about why my life is such a mess and what I've learnt so far from it. The first story is about education, courage, and determination. This story is set in a rural village near Galle in Sri Lanka, and this is where my mother was born. She was born to very humble beginnings. She went to a school with no walls and walked to it without any shoes. When she was 8, her father, my grandfather, lost his job, throwing a family that was worth about as much money as the clothes on my back today into financial ruin. Forced her to work as well as study under kerosene lamp at night time to keep up with her other students. On the fateful day her Year 12 results came out, she raced back home to find out how she went. My grandfather beat her to it. He had her results open in his hands, and he studied it closely, solidly, paused in pensive thought, and tears streaming down his face. And when she saw this, she thought she had completely blown it. She thought she had failed. The life outside of the village had completely evaporated. The truth was that she not only topped her school, but topped her entire state. My grandfather was crying because he just couldn't afford to send such a talented girl to university. It was a good news story. She actually got a scholarship to study economics at Colombo University. She lived her life by the motto of expanding your life by the limits of your mind and expanding your mind to the limit of your life. And she did that. She got a scholarship to do an honours. Then she got another scholarship to do a master's, and then she got another scholarship to travel to the UK and do a PhD. 5 days after she finished her doctorate, I was born, and I was born into the cold Scottish winter. And I'd been born to a completely different world to the one that she had known, one where everything was possible if I put my mind to it. And I owed it all to a very humble beginning. And it wasn't just me who benefited from this. My mum continued her life with a great amount of dignity, compassion, and a great deep-seated sense of responsibility to give back to her family and the community from where she came from. Indeed, the first stipend scholarship from the Bradford University, she actually sent back the first pounds back home, where her home was connected to electricity. She also spent some more money to build 2 wells that still service the village where she came from. So it's not just me who's benefited from this, and this is why I'm so passionate about education. You know, today is the 32nd year anniversary of when she actually hopped on a plane to travel from a tiny little village all the way to London. And she told me about her first day in London. she was really scared. She had to find a hostel, and all the buildings started looking the same. And she tried to find something to eat, and she could find something in a corner store, and she bought some chicken, and she went back to the hostel. And being unaccustomed to electric stoves, she actually placed the piece of chicken in the sink and submerged it in hot water and waited for the chicken to turn white, where she reasoned it was cooked. And that was her first meal in London. It pointed out to me that there was clearly a big gap in technology and her understanding of electric stoves and the wood fire where she was used to, and basically, it still didn't hamper how she went at school. She still went on and did 5 degrees and became an extraordinary economist. And I think to myself, if she was born in this day and age, same place, same beginnings, would she still be able to get to the same heights? The truth is, what I believe is now the world that's moved so quickly with technology, with computers and the internet, this technology gap has broadened to a point where it is stopping people from progressing to the next level. And this is echoed by Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, who talked about the Millennium Development Goals and how kids had enrolled all around the world in high numbers in primary school. However, something was stopping them from going to secondary and tertiary education. He talked about a digital divide. And this is where we placed our efforts. We first of all did the diplomacy between countries, and then we went on to talk at very high levels and a ministerial level to then build schools in regional parts of the developing world. And we learnt a whole bunch of interesting values as we cut our teeth in the aid space. One of the lessons that we learnt is before you get into this space, it's very important that you understand what you believe is a basic human right and what you think is a basic human responsibility, and the clear line that defines the two. Without understanding this, it's easy to actually do harm to the very people that you're trying to help by taking power away from individuals and communities. And as a doctor, I made an oath to first do no harm. Another value that we found that just because people are poor, it doesn't mean that they are good. I was writing out checks naively, and we realised that there was a lot of corruption at all levels. Rich people, poor people, people in the middle. And if we were going to be successful in this competitive landscape, we needed to run an organisation with the same vigour as we did with any organisation in the private sector. We also found that when people were desperate, really desperate, that they would latch on to any of your agendas. And we knew if we were going to do aid work in the developing world ethically, that we would be devoid of any political or religious or financial agenda. The second story is about Bunnings hardware stores, infertility, and burritos. When I was 21 and I was building the first Zambrero store, I didn't have a lot of cash, and I had to save money any way I could. So I walked into a Bunnings and I inquired about paint. A guy told me everything about paint. He knew about Pantones, he knew about tinted undercoat to save money on your feature walls. And I was curious about people and the world around me, and I asked him, do you have like a degree in paint? How do you know so much? And he said, no, I don't even really work here during the weekdays. I'm only here on the weekend so my wife and I can save up enough money to pay for IVF because we're having some problems falling pregnant. And I said, great, I'm a medical student, tell me everything about it. And he did, and we actually had a chat for an hour at the aisles of the Bunnings hardware store talking about these issues. At the end of which he actually wished me well with the restaurants, and I wished him well with his fertility. And he vanishes completely from this story. I went on to build the Zambrero store in Braddon, in Lonsdale Street. And 6 months into it, we were doing well. Another chap came to me and said, "I'd like to franchise your restaurant." And I said, "Fantastic." That was always part of the vision. He went off and talked to his lawyers and accountants. And they came back and they said, "You know, you're still a 21-year-old punk kid, and you're still a uni student, and you've had no business background, let alone franchising background, and your business hasn't even run for 6 months. We're strongly advising our client not pay the $500,000 check to build a Zambrero restaurant." I went, ouch, just winded. And I felt a setback. And very clearly that year, I understood that business was very simple to me. It always seemed to be a race between time and your will. And indeed, I actually got a break. A couple of weeks later, the same chap called me back and he said, "You know what, screw it, let's do it, let's build the restaurant." And he did. And he made himself very successful, a millionaire. And after getting to know him a little bit better, I said, "Why? Why did you do it? Why did you go against your legal counsel?" And he said, "Well, you know that guy who served you paint the first day you built your restaurant? Well, you didn't know this, but he was my best friend, and he didn't know you. But when I told him about you, he said, yeah, I met him, and I didn't get to know him very well, but I trusted him. And that was enough for me." And I signed the check. And I thought about how that completely changed my trajectory in business, how it changed my trajectory in aid work and in medicine, just after asking that simple question to a person who sold me paint. And I'm not going to kind of indulge in this kind of fantastic thinking that perhaps that angel was sent into Bunnings one day. In fact, I think we do that as humans. I think we kind of try and find meaning in randomness. I think that the truth is probably more fantastic than this magical thinking. The truth is that if you have a dream or a vision, then the people who can help you do that are everywhere around you. Every minute of the day, every day of your life. They're waiting for you to take an interest and be curious. The third story is about Argentina, vintage cars, and following your dreams. This is set in a suburban car park where I was actually buying some groceries and putting it in the back of my car. Next to my car was this old vintage car, so old that the wheels were made out of steel and wood. And it wasn't ostentatious, although raised off the ground, because the whole car was plastered in South American flags. And just outside the car was this tiny little backpack, and I thought that the backpack belonged to the car, but I wasn't quite sure. So I left a note on the car and I said, "I've got your backpack, give me a call if it's yours." And I took it. And 3 hours later, I got a call and they said, "Indeed, it is my backpack, can you return it?" And I said, "Sure." And when I came back to return it, this guy came from nowhere and says, "Hi, my name is Herman. And this," pointing to his wife, "is my wife, Candy. And my dream is to take that vintage car from Argentina to Alaska." And I thought, wow, what an amazing way to introduce yourself. And immediately you knew that this guy was so full of life, and I said, "I'd love to take you out to dinner and learn more about you and your life." And he said, "Sure." I said, "It's a great Mexican restaurant." He said, "Okay, let's do it." And indeed, we went to a Zambrero restaurant, and he told me about this epic journey, of this old vintage car that he actually completed his dream from Argentina to Alaska. It broke down every second day. It balanced, precariously on a boat as it kind of went up the Amazon. It fought heat and really cold climates. He actually had a baby on the back of it near Alaska. And I asked him probably the same questions that you'd ask him if you were sitting across the table from him at dinner. I said, how did you do it? Did you have a lot of money? And he said, no. I said, you must be like an adventurer, wrestle alligators with your hands. And he's like, no. I said, well, you must have had friends just kind of peppered all around the Americas that you could have, drawn on for support. And he said, I didn't have one friend. I said, well, how the hell did you do it? How did you get through this with no money, no shelter, and no experience? And he said, simple. Whenever I came across a stranger along the way, I'd say, hi, my name is Herman, and this is my wife, Candy. And my dream is to take this vintage car from Argentina to Alaska. And he said there's something very powerful about that. When you actually say this, people who are not chasing their dreams would want to vicariously experience what that would be like by living through you, and they would help in any way, and they did get help all across the Americas until they achieved their dream. So these are 3 stories, definitive moments in my life that have shaped it. It's an explanation to why my life is such a mess and why I hope that it always will be. I'm going to end on an introduction to our next big project, our audacious project. It was because of a guy from Canberra called Frank Bowden who inspired me. He was one of my mentors, and he had an interesting feather in his cap. What Frank had done was he was able to eliminate one disease out of Australia completely 10 years ago, a disease called donovanosis, and he did it with $4 million in 4 years with 10 people, which completely blew me away. I didn't think that this was a lot of resources or time or people. And I said, we can do this again. And indeed, we built a board and we brought in Nobel Prize winners, heavy hitters in the business world, and we pit our wills against a disease called scabies. Scabies is a mite that gets under your skin and you itch at it, and then it causes secondary heart and kidney failure. And although none of us really get it in non-Aboriginal Australia, 7 out of 10 Aboriginal kids get it at least once before they're 1. So we began our work, and it has already begun. Our doctors are living in the communities and working with them, not on them. We've been invited in, and we're listening. If you can understand, everything that I've done so far has been working up to this point. It's been an extension of the work that we've done. We've continued our values set and compass that we've learnt in the Asia-Pacific region. We've learnt how to run an organisation like a business. We've been curious and we've listened to the Aboriginal people in the communities. And like Herman and Candy, we've set about a large and audacious dream to eliminate scabies as a health issue out of Australia for good. Thank you.